You may be wondering whether The Chosen will return for a 5th season and when it will air as you watch the dramatic events play out. Discover everything there is to know about The Chosen Season 5 by reading on. Dallas Jenkins is the creator, director, and co-writer of the faith-based television series The Chosen. That historical drama centers on the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth and the individuals who encountered and interacted with him. It is set in 1st century Judea and Galilee. In addition to Shahar Isaac, Elizabeth Tabish, Noah James, George H. Xanthus, and Paris Patel, Jonathan Rumi portrays Jesus Christ. Earlier this year, the 4th season had its theatrical debut. Beginning in early June, fans could finally begin watching the new episodes at home after protracted streaming delays brought on by legal concerns. Season 4 was, according to Jenkins, the most emotionally charged season by far, but he also intimated that Season 5 will be even more so given the events it will cover. The creator stated to Deseret News in May, we're covering the most famous and impactful week in the history of the world, Holy Week. Learn everything there is to know about the upcoming 5th season of The Chosen, including the cast, story, and premiere date. Will Season 5 of The Chosen happen? Yes, a 5th season renewal has been given to The Chosen, which will now have a total of 7 seasons. Jenkins and a few other writers have been working on the show's future, including its conclusion. We really want to make sure that we know where we're going with everything. So we went to Sundance, spent a few days there, and just sketched out the outlines and started to work on some of the screenplays for Seasons 6 and 7, the director told Deseret News. Has Season 5 of The Chosen filming begun? Yes, in April 2024, filming for The Chosen Season 5 got underway. The majority of this summer's production will take place in Texas, the show's home base, after filming got underway in Utah. Jenkins told Variety, "The response to Season 4 has been overwhelming so far, which provides a nice lift for us as we head into filming. Of course, the excitement from the previous season never lasts long, because we're about to attempt to depict the most well-known week in human history. Covering a week in Season 5 feels opulent, because the entirety of Season 6 will take place in one day." When will Season 5 of The Chosen air? The release date for The Chosen Season 5 is still unclear, but if everything goes according to plan, Season 5 might debut around early to mid-2025, according to past release trends. For instance, The Chosen's Season 4 began production in July 2023, following the signing of a SAG-AFTRA interim agreement to carry on with work despite the actor strike that has now been settled. On February 1, 2024, the show made its theatrical debut 6 or 7 months later. Whether Season 5 of The Chosen will be released in theaters like Season 4 has not yet been disclosed. If so, the show's episodes in theaters will probably be released in staggered releases, similar to Season 4. A few weeks or months later, Season 5 will eventually be accessible on The Chosen TV and select streaming providers. Who makes up the selected cast of Season 5? According to Variety, every member of the Season 4 cast of The Chosen, including Jonathan Rumi as Jesus Christ, will return for the upcoming episode. See a few of the cast members who are returning below. Jonathan Rumi as Jesus Christ, Shahar Isaac as Simon Peter, Paris Patel as Matthew, Elizabeth Tabish as Mary Magdalene, Noah James as Andrew, George H. Xanthus as John, Abe Bueno Jalad as Big James, Jordan Walker Ross as Little James, Giovanni Cairo as Thaddeus, Joey Vahidi as Thomas, Elias Safi as Simon the Zealot, Austin Reed Alleman as Nathanael, Reza Diaco as Philip, Vanessa Benevent as Mother Mary, Yasmin Al-Bustami as Rama, Luke Dimian as Judas, Lara Silva as Eden, and more. What can we expect from The Chosen Season 5? The Chosen's 5th season will pick up where the 4th one left off, during Holy Week just prior to Jesus Christ's crucifixion. After Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, Jesus and his apostles visit Bethany to console his sisters, Martha and Mary. When they arrive at Lazarus' grave, Jesus brings him back to life. When the Sanhedrin learns of this, the high priest in particular demands that Jesus be turned over to the Romans so they can execute him. Jenkins expressed his excitement to Variety about working on the set of the Garden of Gethsemane, the scene where Jesus is arrested and betrayed. He continued, "Nobody has ever seen what we have in store for that sequence." In 2017, The Chosen began as a crowd-funded streaming initiative. The show was a huge hit on all the streaming services, including the CW, Peacock, Netflix, and Prime Video. According to a research by independent analyst Sandy Padula, 108 million individuals have viewed at least part of one episode by the end of 2022. Episode 2 of the 4th season of The Chosen. What happened to it? During the first scene of the 2nd episode, Jesus has a dream in which he meets John the Baptist and witnesses his cousin breaking free from his chains and heading toward a mountain covered in snow. After Jesus awakens from the dream, he discovers that Andrew is also awake. In the process of working through their grief over John, the two individuals discuss the reasons why they aren't quite as overcome with sorrow as they had anticipated being. Jesus makes the observation that there is no correct way to grieve, and that the times when we are experiencing the most profound sadness are frequently also the times when we are laughing the most. Because Andrew believes that Jesus is a mystery, Jesus is motivated to continue the Shiva, mourning, for John while they are traveling on the open road, which is John's true home. As Jesus guides his followers in the direction of Mount Hermon, they engage in conversation along the way. Thomas and Rama come to the conclusion that they should invite Jesus to be Rama's witness and surrogate father at their engagement. Jesus makes use of this occasion to have a conversation with the disciple about his mission. He has not come to bring peace, but rather a sword and division, even among families, because the demand to love God is stronger than the command to honor one's father and mother. Matthew 10:34-39. Following this, Rama informs Thomas that she does not really require a wedding gift, and he accepts her at face value. This prompts Simon to take Thomas aside and discuss the nuances of communication in a married relationship. As the disciples go closer to Caesarea Philippi, Mount Hermon, they start to come across ruins of pagan altars to Baal. Finally, they arrive at the gates of hell, which is a cultic complex located outside of a cave that the pagan people believe to be an entrance into the underworld, especially when they come across goats that have been brought in for the implied purpose of ritual bestiality. The disciples are repulsed by all of the pagan worship that is taking place inside the temple. As Jesus makes his way to the altar of Pan, which is located outside the gates of hell, he reacts to the disapproval of his disciples by asking them if they should avoid dark regions out of fear or whether they should be light to them. Despite being in a dark environment like this cave, John did not shy away from it. First, he inquires about the individuals who are seen as being outsiders, and then he questions the individuals who are regarded as being outsiders. Jesus gives Simon the name Peter, which means rock, when he proclaims that he is the Christ. He then goes on to say that he is constructing his church on this rock, and that even the gates of hell will not be able to stop it. The disciples are commanded to remain courageous in the face of evil and to be willing to follow him anyway, even if it means going to sinister places like this one. On that particular evening, when the disciples were camping, Big James and John disagreed and argued regarding Simon's promotion to the position of Peter. Whether Simon is now the best or top is a question that the disciples are considering. Matthew feels compelled to talk to Jesus in private as a result of this. It is beyond his comprehension that Jesus would promote Simon in light of the fact that he has been so harsh to Matthew. Matthew is encouraged by Jesus to ask Simon to pardon him for all of the hurt he caused as a tax collector. Jesus understands Matthew's grievance, but he also encourages Matthew to apologize to Simon. Matthew is hesitant because he does not want to set the stage for a debate. Nonetheless, Jesus insists that there can be no peace as long as his followers continue to harbor anger toward one another. While all of this is going on, back at the camp, Simon Peter invites everyone to go to bed and then leads them in prayer for the evening. Over the course of the following day, John and James continue to complain and speculate about whether or not they may also achieve high positions for themselves. In spite of Judas' concerns about the finances, they purchase pistachios from a seller, and Nathanael proves his expertise by dividing the nuts in an even manner among the 16 followers. Andrew is the recipient of some of the self-doubt that Simon Peter is experiencing as a result of his breakdown in judgment during the previous season. As this is going on, Tamar is questioning Matthew about how he is able to determine what should be included in his account. Matthew finally goes to Simon Peter and apologizes to him and pleads for forgiveness, but Simon walks away frustrated. Jesus is the one who prompted Matthew to go to Simon Peter. During that night, as Simon Peter sits in bed with Eden, unable to sleep, he recalls the awful night in Season 1, Episode 4, when he railed against God as he battled to catch enough fish to pay off his debt. He was unable to sleep because he was unable to find enough fish. As he stands up, he discovers Jesus outside of the city and inquires as to why he should forgive Matthew after having committed sins against him more than 7 times. According to Matthew 18:15-20, Jesus argues that he must forgive not 7 but 70 times 7, which is the maximum amount that is required. On the other hand, Simon Peter is reminded of what transpired as a result of Matthew's acts, an interaction between Simon and Jesus. Still, Simon has a hard time accepting what he is required to do, and he walks out in a furious manner. As the sun begins to rise, John makes a proposal to Thomas, offering to assist him in acquiring a present for Rama by exchanging some of his mother's pastries. Simon Peter arrives, and upon seeing Matthew, he walks up to him and gives him a hug. After forgiving him, he observes that everything turned out for the best. This is a reference to the famous sentence that Joseph says in Genesis 50:20, and he promises to be by his side till the very end of the planet. During the time when Yusuf is getting ready for the day, he is reciting the words of Koheleth, Ecclesiastes, and pondering on the transient nature of this world and all of its wealth. Immediately, his gaze is drawn to a key that he perceives to have a secret significance. Nonetheless, he immediately shuts it away. Nathan, a local resident, seeks professional advice in order to address his ongoing and incapacitating fear. Yusuf acknowledges the notion that the man is carrying the suffering of their ancestors in his bones and promises to pray with him on a daily basis. He is on the verge of referring to him as Jesus, but he refrains. Jairus brings the news that Shmuel has been promoted to the Sanhedrin and Nicodemus has been absent from it. They are afraid that the rumors of the feeding of the 5,000 will cause trouble at the Sanhedrin. Yusuf asks Jairus how his daughter is doing after the man has left. They are unable to discuss her healing in detail for fear of being overheard. In order to commemorate his membership in the Sanhedrin, Shmuel is presented with new robes. During this occasion, he engages in conversation with Yanni about his meeting with Jesus and the time they spent praying together. His opposition is now being called into doubt as a result of Jesus' genuineness. Following Yanni's dismissal of his uncertainties, Shmuel raises the topic of whether or not the Sanhedrin is truly concerned with the betterment of their nation, or whether or not they are too preoccupied with meaningless posturing. Rabbi Shammai extends a warm welcome to Shmuel and expresses his admiration for the efforts that he has made to expose Jesus during the Sanhedrin meeting. Since of his contempt for the Torah and his readiness to associate with tax collectors, women, Gentiles, and zealots, he accuses Jesus of being a false prophet. He says this since Jesus was willing to associate with all of these groups. There is an attempt made by a rabbi named Shimon to defend Jesus, but he is immediately silenced by the crowd. A remark made in passing about John's passing touches Shmuel, which further strengthens his uncertainty. While this is going on, the high priest Caiaphas addresses the Sanhedrin and insists that they refrain from carrying out the law of Moses on their own, and instead use questions to trap Jesus until they are able to convince Rome to deal with him. They do not want Rome to view them as those who cultivate the seeds of bloodshed and insurrection. Throughout the land of Israel, 4 riders are dispatched to receive instructions from local leaders to oppose and trap Jesus. At the same time as Shmuel is still trying to come to terms with the news that John has passed away, Yanni offers that he be the one to locate Jesus and bring him before the Sanhedrin. It dawns on Shmuel that he must, in fact, carry out this step. Upon arriving in Capernaum, one of the horsemen brings the news of the edict that was issued against Jesus. During the course of Yusuf and Jairus' deliberations, Yusuf comes to the conclusion that he must depart from Capernaum and make use of his father's wealth and power in order to secure a seat in the Sanhedrin, and further indication of his true identity. A mystery satchel is retrieved by him with the use of the key that he had been eyeing previously. Quintus is in the process of having his bust carved when Atticus shows up and requests the most recent information about Jesus. This occurs at the beginning of the episode. In response to Quintus's inquiry as to why he appears to be so nervous, Atticus shares his anxiety regarding the possibility that the reaction to the ministry of Jesus could escalate into a civil war. He cautions Quintus that the only thing that is keeping him in the good graces of Pilate is the substantial amount of tax revenue that he has, and he begs Quintus to take action in order to bring the threat under control. After some time has passed, Quintus calls Gaius and Julius, the other centurion. As he fumes about the current state of affairs, he demands that they remove the tent city within a week's time. Matthew is the person that Gaius runs into as he is leaving the meeting. Matthew is aware that Gaius is distressing due to the circumstances surrounding his family. and he proposes that Gaius seek assistance from Jesus. Similar to Gaius, he experiences feelings of anxiety and confusion upon waking up each day, yet he is able to find peace by concentrating on the one thing that truly matters, which is following Jesus. Gaius cannot be bothered with it. It is his recommendation to Matthew that Jesus refrain from giving public sermons under the current state of stress. A review of the second episode of the fourth season of The Chosen. I enjoyed The Chosen Season 4 Episode 2 for a number of reasons, including the following. It is not necessary for me to repeat myself, but the points I made in the first episode review regarding the production quality, minor character performances, and pacing are still valid. The fact that they brought the disagreement between Matthew and Simon full circle and gave Matthew the opportunity to continue to seek forgiveness and repent for his acts in the past is something that I very much appreciate. It is highly conceivable that the issue would be reopened after Simon was elevated to a higher position, despite the fact that it would be extremely simple for the show to forget about the disagreements that existed between the two of them. A good job was done by the show in examining the conflict from both sides of the argument. Without slamming us over the head with information, the program did an excellent job of examining the concept of status and elevation from a variety of different points of view. For more information, see below. I found Jesus' talk of sadness to be, for the most part, enjoyable, despite the fact that it appeared to be quite contemporary and out of date. James and John's grousing and dissatisfaction, which builds up gradually, is another aspect that I enjoy. This is not just humorous, we can be flags on top of the home, but is also very genuine. I was taken aback by Shmuel's sudden uncertainty, and I appreciate how it adds a richer layer of humanity and complexity to his character. Although I did have a few complaints, the majority of them are about the bigger picture. It seems as though the story of Jesus and his followers could have been broken up into 2 episodes. The first episode could have been about Jesus' anguish, which led up to his statement about the gates of hell. The second episode could have been about the aftermath of Simon being promoted to the position of Peter. I believe that the aftermath of John's death was not adequately addressed as it was. Indeed, individuals experience grief in a variety of ways. Nevertheless, the significance of this argument would be enhanced if we witnessed a wide range of reactions to John's passing. It would have been nice if some of the disciples had expressed concern. They killed John. Now what if they come after us? Regret. Is there more we could have done? And nostalgia? Remember that time, John? I would have enjoyed it if some of the disciples had expressed these emotions. It turned out that Andrew and Jesus were the only ones who were able to witness the events of the previous episode being processed by them. The reason that the narrative of Gaius' child being healed has been delayed for such a long time is something that I continue to wonder about. The plot of the previous season had a lot of drive, but it seems to have lost some of that impetus now. Additionally, the family issue of Gaius was a topic that was centered on Simon during the previous season, so it seems unusual to flip it around and put it on Matthew now. Concerns have been raised regarding the manner in which the Pharisees have handled the situation. On occasion, it seems as though The Chosen is attempting to demonstrate to us how the Sanhedrin went from being indifferent to Jesus to plotting his execution over the course of the story. However, the storyline is then abandoned at arbitrary intervals, and by the time it is resumed, the circumstances have undergone a massive transformation. This took place not only between the end of Season 3 and the present day, but also between the middle of Season 3 and the end of Season 2. There is a tale that is intriguing. Nevertheless, I hope that the program could follow it a little bit more thoroughly and connect some of the dots. The change in Atticus' character from trying to prevent Quintus from destroying the tent city to pressing him to act more decisively would have left me perplexed if I hadn't had my talk with Elijah Alexander. I would have been baffled about the shift in Atticus' character. It's possible that the show wants the reasons behind Atticus' actions to remain a mystery, but it would have been beneficial if they had done a little bit more to give us a better understanding of the shift in his perspective. In this regard, it is possible that a chat between him and Gaius would have been beneficial having taken place. By presenting us with a number of uplifting instances, Episode 2 demonstrates the significance of exposing oneself to the risk of experiencing uncomfortable emotions and working through them with other people. At the beginning of the episode, Jesus and Andrew find themselves working through the complicated feelings that they are experiencing in response to John's passing. In spite of the fact that Andrew is embarrassed by the fact that he is feeling so wonderful, Jesus reassures him that there is no correct way to grieve and that it is even acceptable to laugh. Nathan receives assistance from Yusuf in overcoming his nervousness, and he is invited to meet with him on a daily basis to pray and discuss together. Over the help of Andrew, Simon Peter is able to work over his feelings of self-doubt. During their conversation, Matthew reveals to Gaius the methods that he uses to manage his anxiousness. Episode 2 also gives us a few counter instances that highlight the frustration that we experience when we are unable to work through our profound ideas and feelings. These examples are as follows. Shmuel makes an effort to work through the uncertainties that have arisen as a result of his encounter with Jesus, but Yanni dismisses him without more question. Later on, Shmuel expresses his desire to comprehend the news of John's passing, but once again, Yanni is completely unconcerned about the matter. Matthew is the one who has to prod Gaius in order to get him to stop trying to hide his uneasiness. In the end, the storyline that deals with forgiveness is also a specific component of this overarching subject. Matthew avoids confrontation because he is afraid of being vulnerable and of having to work through the tough feelings and resentment that could come if he were to ask Simon for forgiveness. This motivation is what drives Matthew's conflict avoidance. The act of Simon Peter walking away from Matthew when he finally works up the confidence to talk is a symbolic move that also shows his unwillingness to deal with tough emotions and the hatred he feels against Matthew. Both men are miserable as a result of their inability to be vulnerable. Matthew is plagued by feelings of guilt and resentment, and Simon finds that he is unable to sleep as he repeats events from the past. The only way for the two men to ultimately be able to embrace each other as brothers is for them to first talk to Jesus and work through their frustrations and challenges. This is the only way that they are finally able to be liberated from the irritation and debilitating bitterness that result from trying to hide painful emotions. When we first hear Yusuf reading the words of Ecclesiastes, it appears to be a moment that is not particularly significant. It is merely a small amount of additional scripture that is crammed into the episode. As soon as we are aware of the significance of the key that he is looking at while he is reciting Ecclesiastes, however, we will be able to comprehend the opening scenario in a more profound manner. The book of Ecclesiastes makes a number of important points, one of which is that success in this world is nothing more than a transitory vapor that evades our grip and is, in the end, worthless and empty. It would suggest that Yusuf recite this verse in order to protect himself from the temptation of utilizing his father's wealth and power in order to achieve higher status and elevate himself. It is sufficient for him to be a humble rabbi, assisting lowly individuals like Nathan in coping with the issues that they face on a daily basis. However, by the time the episode is over, Yusuf has come to the realization that he must, in fact, make use of his father's wealth in order to seek a position in the Sanhedrin. This is not because he desires the status and elevation that comes with the position. Rather, it is because God has called him to make use of his privilege in order to advocate for Jesus and those who follow him. The most optimistic perspective on how followers of Jesus can think about status and elevation is presented in this episode of the second season. At the beginning of the episode, Shmuel finds himself in a circumstance that is purposefully similar to that of Yusuf. She is getting dressed for the day. The difference between Yusuf's perspective on status and the way that status is handled by the leaders of the Sanhedrin is heightened as a result of this phenomenon. Shmuel begins his day by listening to the exaggerated words of Yanni, rather than repeating the words of Ecclesiastes, which are a source of grace and humility. In spite of this, Shmuel starts to have doubts about the meaningless pomp. He appears to be quite dissatisfied when he is eventually inducted into the Sanhedrin, which is the elevation that he has waited for such a long time already. It would appear that Shammai and the other Pharisees are more concerned with maintaining their status than they are with discovering the truth. At this point in the episode, it appears that he is really considering the consequences of his actions and whether or not he ought to make an effort to shield Jesus from the order. Quintus is yet another example of having a negative attitude towards status seeking. At the beginning of the episode, he is preoccupied with the question of whether or not the sculptor who is carving his bust is capturing his positive side. He becomes extremely anxious when Atticus threatens to destroy the sign that represents his rank. When it comes to addressing Jesus and the tent city, the only thing that he is truly concerned about is how the situation reflects on his personal status with Rome. This is something that he deals with on a regular basis. As the disciples attempt to make sense of Peter's elevation, a crisis arises among them when Jesus renames Simon as Peter and announces that the church will be founded on him. This causes the disciples to be overwhelmed with confusion. Big James and John are irritated that they did not receive the same elevation. and they spend a significant amount of time contemplating the means by which they can achieve a position that is comparable to or even higher than that of their peers. Concerns have been raised by other disciples regarding the possibility that the introduction of rank will result in a formal hierarchy similar to that of the military, or whether Jesus simply intended for Peter to be first among equals. In a humorous moment, Andrew makes a jest about the fact that in order for the other disciples to book appointments with Simon Peter, they must first submit a formal request. The idea that someone who has behaved in such a harsh manner would be accorded such a high rank is something that Matthew finds quite frustrating. Simon Peter, on the other hand, is primarily interested in harnessing his rank and elevation in an appropriate manner. While the rest are gathered around the fireplace, we observe him in the process of putting the finishing touches on the camp. In situations where he perceives that the others are in need of sleep, he not only prays with them, but also urges them to go to sleep. The most essential thing is that he shows that he is willing to forgive Matthew and let go of his animosity against him. In spite of the fact that the program makes fun of Simon's insistence on being named Peter, the majority of the time, this comes across as adorable rather than vain or conceited. Additionally, the topic of status is brought up in the discussion that is taking place about Rama's father. Parents are entrusted with a position of authority over their children that is worthy of respect. However, their status is not an absolute one, and they are not obligated to fully respect it. When a parent makes an attempt to utilize his or her position to act in opposition to God, that parent must be rejected. Bible Study and Discussion Guide for the second episode of the 4th season of The Chosen, exploring the chosen with small groups and young people. Before you watch the second episode of the 4th season of The Chosen, review questions. Episode 2 of The Chosen Season 4 is largely a reaction to the killing of John the Baptist, which occurred in the first episode of the season. Unless individuals have already viewed the first episode of the show as well as all of the seasons that came before it, I would not recommend that they participate in the study. Even though they might be able to follow the basic flow of events, they won't be able to understand the emotional impact of these events or how they fit into the character arcs that have been developing during the course of the show. In spite of the fact that you are watching with people who are current, I would nonetheless recommend that you conduct some review. When it comes to reviewing, I would recommend asking the following questions. What transpired at the conclusion of the first episode? In what ways do you believe the various characters are expressing their reactions to the event? An update on Thomas and Rama was also provided to us in the first episode. When it comes to their relationship, what is going on, and what are their plans for moving forward? In the previous season, Zebedee decided to sell his boat in order to launch a business that would be able to aid in the ministry of Jesus. At the conclusion of the 3rd season, what was the current status of his company? Additionally, the previous season brought attention to Rabbi Yosef and Jairus, who served as his administrator. What information have we gathered on these two people up to this point? During the first season of The Chosen, it was revealed that Simon and Matthew had known each other prior to their decision to become disciples. During the course of the most recent several seasons, how has their history impacted their relationship, and what is their history? Questions for Bible study and conversation to consider before watching the second episode of Season 4 of The Chosen. In spite of the fact that the most significant biblical event that takes place in Episode 2 is the renaming of Simon to Peter, the episode appears to be more concerned with the relational aftermath of the event than it is with the actual content of the interaction itself. Considering that, according to the timeline of the show, there has never been a great deal of uncertainty over the identity of Jesus among the disciples. This does not come as a particularly shocking development. In addition, as the season progresses and the subject of death becomes more relevant, we will provide a great deal more information regarding what it means for the church to storm the gates of hell. In light of all of this, rather than starting with an examination of the well-known, you should ask yourself, who do you say that I am? Instead of beginning with the verse, Matthew 16:13-20, I will begin with the teaching that Jesus gave on forgiveness and reconciliation because it is more significant from a theological standpoint. Before you begin your research, you should be aware that the second episode will involve a significant disagreement between two of Jesus' disciples. It is important to explain that you will be examining the most well-known and in-depth talk that Jesus had regarding how to resolve conflicts, seek forgiveness, and work toward reconciliation. In that case, read the passage that follows. You should go to your brother and tell him his fault, but only between the two of you. If your brother has sinned against you, you will have gained your brother if he allows himself to listen to you. In the event that he does not pay attention, however, you should bring along 1 or 2 additional witnesses so that the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses can be used to establish each and every charge. Inform the church of his refusal to listen to them if he continues to do so. Let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector if he continues to refuse to listen to anything, including the counsel of the church. In all sincerity, I declare to you that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Once more, I want to tell you that if 2 of you on earth are in agreement about anything that they ask for, then my Father in heaven will grant their request. Because wherever there are 2 or 3 people joined together in my name, I am there among them. Peter then approached him and asked, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I will forgive him?" Peter then went from there. "Is it possible that 7 times?" In response to his question, Jesus responded, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. The author writes, "A person who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. This occurred when he was beginning to settle down. And because he was unable to pay, his owner gave the order for him to be sold together with his wife and children and everything else he owned, with the condition that payment be paid. Because of this, the servant knelt down and begged his employer to free him and forgive him of the debt. He said, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' The master of the servant was moved by compassion for the servant and released him. But when that same servant went out, he discovered one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him while saying, 'Pay what you owe.' As a result, his fellow servant fell down and begged him to repay him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' However, he refused to do so and instead went and put him in prison until he paid the debt. As soon as his fellow servants witnessed what had transpired, they were filled with a great deal of concern, and therefore they went and informed their master about all that had taken place. Then his lord called him to his attention and addressed him, saying, 'You wicked servant, because of your pleading with me, I decided to forgive you for all of that debt. Furthermore, you ought to have shown mercy to your fellow servant in the same way that I showed mercy to you.' And in a fit of rage, his owner handed him over to the jailers, who would hold him there until he paid off all of his obligation. If you don't forgive your brother from the depths of your heart, then my heavenly Father will do the same to each and every one of you." Matthew 18:15-35, English Standard Version. Discuss the following questions when you have finished reading. There are times when younger Christians are taken aback when they learn about the amount of discord that exists inside the church. How come? Jesus outlines a rather straightforward method for resolving conflicts in his teachings. Specifically, what are the several stages that he recommends, and why is each one equally important? Christians have a tendency to try to avoid having unpleasant talks and frequently try to push their disagreements under the rug rather than following the path that Jesus outlined for pursuing peace. Can you name a few of the issues that arise from using this approach? Do you have any experience with the church's approach to conflict resolution? So, what took place? The term cancel culture refers to a different approach that modern people frequently take to resolve conflicts. In cancel culture, when an individual has a disagreement with another person, they will make the disagreement public, typically through social media, and attempt to persuade other individuals to cancel or dissociate themselves from the other individual. Can you name a few of the issues that arise from using this approach? Have you witnessed someone in the church or among Christians online engaging in the practice of cancel culture? So, what took place? Do you believe that there are ever circumstances in which it is permissible to skip some of the steps in the process that Jesus goes through? What are the reasons, if any? Peter is under the impression that he is being rather compassionate when he asks Jesus 7 times if he should forgive his brother. The response that Jesus gives is not a literal limit on the number of times that we should forgive. Rather, it is essentially a Jewish way of expressing as much as is required. What is it about this teaching that makes it so difficult to understand and so significant? Take into consideration a recent disagreement you've had in light of the parable that Jesus spoke about the servant who refused to forgive. In what ways does the tale prompt us to reflect on other disputes and personal grievances that we have experienced? Bible study and discussion questions following the viewing of the 2nd episode of the 4th season of The Chosen. I usually ask people a handful of fundamental questions after they have watched an episode of The Chosen, which are as follows. Which aspects of the episode stood out to you the most? With what did you feel the strongest connection? Are there any questions that you have? Were there any unclear points? In the event that the conversation takes on a life of its own, I strongly recommend that you do not feel constrained by the questions that are to follow. Instead, I encourage you to run with it. On the other hand, if you feel that you require further structure, you might highlight the following. The second episode of the 4th season shows a significant biblical event. Simon declares his belief that Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus answers by naming him Peter, rock, and stating that he would establish his church on this rock. This represents a significant point in the Bible. Within the context of the church, when we discuss this passage, we often center our attention on the truth that Simon Peter is declaring and on the intention of Jesus to form his church. The second episode, on the other hand, has a greater emphasis on how the other disciples would have interpreted the event. However, the Gospels do call emphasis to the fact that the disciples fought among themselves over who would be the best, and these battles are nearly always reported after the name of Simon. This is despite the fact that the Gospels do not relate how the other disciples reacted to the renaming of Simon. The question is now, as a result of the renaming of Simon, a number of disciples, including Big James and John, expressed disappointment and jealousy. Are you able to recall a time, particularly in the setting of the church, when you felt envious of the way in which Jesus blessed another individual? What types of erroneous assumptions about Jesus and ourselves are at the heart of these expressions of emotion? A negative reaction is also exhibited by Matthew in response to the renaming of Simon. This reaction is not a result of envy, but rather of the resentment that Matthew still harbors for the way Simon treated him. Would you be able to recall a time, particularly in the setting of the church, when you experienced feelings of resentment because of the way in which Jesus praised someone who had wronged you? What are your thoughts on the response that Jesus gave to Matthew? In what ways does it relate to some of the ideas that we talked about earlier, as well as to the other teachings that Jesus gave concerning wrath, conflict, and forgiveness? When Matthew makes an effort to apologize, Simon Peter initially does not engage in listening to him. When you have made an effort to apologize in a real manner, have you ever been unsuccessful? How did you truly feel? Just try to put yourself in Simon Peter's position. What causes him to have such a difficult time accepting Matthew's apology? On the whole, what do you believe causes him to change his mind? Even though Jesus instructs us to forgive others in the same way that we have been forgiven, there are occasions when forgiveness takes some time. One of the reasons why it is essential to refrain from pressuring individuals to immediately provide forgiveness. It was not regarded a virtue for leaders in the pagan world to be humble, with the exception of those who followed Christianity and Judaism. What is the significance of humility, particularly among those in positions of authority, that is brought to light by the difficult conflict that occurs in episode 2? What are some ways in which the circumstances of the incident could have been significantly more disastrous if both Simon Peter and Matthew lacked humility? How do we practice humility on a personal level, particularly when we find ourselves in a position of disagreement with other people?